Welcome to the third of our classes on In the Beginning, looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at chapter 2 and looking at the first people, a little bit more detail of what happened when the first people were created. Here's a little outline for chapter 2. We're going to see a man formed, placed in a specially made garden, then God's instructions to the man, and then a woman formed as a helper for man. The remainder of chapter 2, from verse 5 onward, elaborates on the creation of humans on day 6. As this was the climax and the important part of creation, a chapter is devoted to the details of the beginning of humans. Now, many find a contradiction between Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Peter Williams put it this way. He said, E.J. Young, in his wonderful little book, In the Beginning, says that Genesis is a remarkable piece of writing, and whoever the so-called editor was who put the documents together in their present form must have been a true genius. But then he goes on to make the important point. If he was such a genius, would he not have realized it was not very sensible to put two conflicting accounts of creation together? The answer must be, of course he would. The truth is that until the higher critics came on the scene, no one ever considered for one moment that Genesis 1 and 2 are different accounts of creation, which I would say they are the same count. Rather than presenting an alternative creation account, it seems to me that it's presenting a more detailed account of verses 26 and 27 of chapter 1. That's a very common literary device that we find in many cultures. First, we're given general information, a summary, if you will, and then we're given details to highlight the area of greatest importance. I think that's what we see as we get into chapter 2. So we find another brief description of creation. When the earth was made, there were no cultivated plants yet. Some translations, no plants of the field or the herbs of the field. And the reason was there had been no rain and there's no man to cultivate the soil. So we've got an environment where you've got a lot of wild plants. We're told that there was a mist or a vapor or a spring, depending on your translation, that would come up and water the ground. Rain is not mentioned until Noah and the ark. Although this is not conclusive evidence that the first rain occurred then, it is indeed a possibility. The Hebrew word for mist that many translations have literally means a flow or inundation. NIV indicates this with there was a stream. This could possibly refer instead to a form of irrigation, such as springs of water coming up to water the land. Gordon Wenham translates this as the ocean being fresh water, and it rose to water the earth by flooding it. Plants undoubtedly existed as plant life was created on day 3, but it's not yet been cultivated. The word for bush in bush of the field or plant of the field is the Hebrew word siah, siah, which essentially means a shrub of the desert and would probably refer to worthless wild shrubs and bushes, possibly even the thistles and thorns of chapter 3, verse 18. The word for small plant in the small plants of the field or the herbs of the field is the Hebrew word eseb, eseb, and seems to refer to those plants that rely on man to cultivate, or it could refer to plants that could be eaten. Notice as well the use of day here to describe the entire creation week. God's referred to throughout this section as Yahweh Elohim. Yahweh seems to be God's covenant name in the Old Testament, and we even have it used here in reference to creation. God formed man out of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Notice that we're not given the details of how God did this, just that this is what he did. We see from this that the first human was created directly by God and not through a process of evolution from a lower life form. Like animals, humans are beings of flesh and blood, but it's more than this, as he also has an immortal spiritual nature. Chapter 1 emphasized his immortal spiritual nature made in the image of God. Chapter 2, though, emphasizes that God made him from the dust of the earth, emphasizing his physical and mortal side. This, by the way, reflects a common Hebrew view of man, that in humans there is a unity of mortal and immortal, which gives man his harmony. Because our bodies are formed directly by God, this tells us that they are valuable to him and should be to us. We should not waste and abuse our bodies through drugs, that would include tobacco and alcohol, or sexual excess. Our bodies, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 6, and as well as chapter 3, are the temples of the Holy Spirit. Humans and animals are similar in that they are both created by God, presumably from the dust of the ground, and given the principle of life. But that's where the similarity ends, as God did not command life for man, but directly breathed into him the breath of life, imparting to him a soul. Much of modern thinking today, sometimes that's referred to as New Age, does not see any difference between animals and man, while God in the Bible shows man's uniqueness. Humans are more than just animals. Hebrew word for man is Adam, and the Hebrew word for ground is Adama. So we can see how he got his name. He came from the ground. In modern terminology, we might say that the smallest particles of which the earth is composed, the nitrogen, oxygen, calcium, and all the list of elements, went into making the first man. The fact that we are made of the same elements is, by the way, verified by science. But we find reference to this fact in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 45 to 47, it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the physical, and then the spiritual. The first man was of the earth, made of dust, but the second is of heaven. God creates man out of the dust of the earth and breathes into him the breath of life. I've read that this phrase here is actually a plural, that God breathed into his nostrils the breath of lives. That would indicate that Adam was given a soul and the ability to pass souls on to others, which we still do today. This was breathed into him directly by God. That God breathed into man life upholds that scientific principle that life only comes from life. God planted a garden in Eden in the east and put man there. In the garden was every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. Notice that God takes special care of man, a care that is not shown for any other part of the creation. We see the beginning of God's providence, his providential care of people. He cares for all mankind by providing the sustaining of the creation so that we have air to breathe and a way to provide what we need to sustain this. It's called God's general providence. We also begin to see God's special providence, where he takes care of particular people by providing specifically what they need. Here it is to give the man a place to live where it's pleasant and there's good food to eat. We can learn from this special garden that just because people have a nice place to live does not mean that he will have no problems. That's basically the philosophy of the environmentalists today. The first man and soon his wife have the perfect place to live, but they still mess it up. Garden of Eden. Apparently the name Eden means pleasure or delight, or some say a plain. But it's a garden that God specially plants for him. He puts two other trees in this garden. There's the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And many ancient cultures demonstrated a knowledge of the tree of life, as we found references and depictions in some of the artifacts that have been found. The book of Proverbs also uses the tree of life to deal with the concepts of righteousness, of fear, and of wisdom. You see that in Proverbs 3, 11, 13, and 15, verse each in those chapters. Edwin Jones writes, "In this way, the point is made that life is more than just time spent being alive. Life is a means to the end of fellowship with God. The means without the end is vanity and cannot endure. He gives man a life in a garden, something to do. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is not just a source of knowledge. The first man and woman were intelligent beings, would have grown in knowledge without eating from this tree. Henry Morris suggests a better name for this tree might be the tree of the knowing of good and evil, and I think that's probably true. The knowing, the knowledge that this tree imparted was about good and evil. Edwin Jones suggests it gave this knowledge through personal experience rather than through God's instruction. Now, we cannot know precisely where Eden was, but these verses here, from verses 10 down to 17, detail 4 rivers which were formed after the river flowed out of the garden. Now, keep in mind the flood in chapters 6 through 9 of Genesis would have totally changed the earth. So these and our rivers today have the same names. The Tigris and the Euphrates, which are in the Mesopotamian valley, would not necessarily be the same rivers. But as Moses took the time to precisely identify where they are, it would seem they very well could be the same ones, although as the earth seems to have been one landmass at this time, they would not be precisely where they are today, although it could have been Adam rather than Moses who preserved their location here. The first river is called Pishon or Pishon. Literally, that Hebrew word means the springer. It flowed around, probably a better way of translating that would be it makes a winding route through, but the land of Havilah, which we do not know where Havilah was, but it was known for its excellent gold, its bdellium, which was probably a metal, though McCord here in the translation renders it as sweet-smelling gum, as well as onyx, and some translations footnote that as beryl. The second river is the Gihon, literally the gusher, and this one flows surrounds all the land of Cush. And the third river is the Tigris, flowing east of Assyria, so it is identifying where ours is today. Some translations call this Hiddekel. And the fourth one is the Euphrates. Now, obviously, the Tigris and Euphrates are identified in our 2 rivers of the same name in Iraq. Josephus and many ancient writers identified the Pishon, with the Ganges, and the Gihon with the Nile. Those were at least the major rivers in their day and age. But it's probable that these 4 rivers are given in order from east to west. Edwin Jones writes, "We cannot now speak confidently concerning the location of Eden or of the 4 rivers. The flood would have changed the land so greatly that even the Tigris and Euphrates would surely have run a much different course. The identity of the Pishon and Gihon remain in the realm of speculation. In short, we can only have a general knowledge of where Eden was located. The Middle East is about as narrow a location as can be developed. And Henry Morris says, in general, it's evident that the geography described in these verses does not exist in the present world, nor has it ever existed since the flood. The rivers and countries described were antediluvian geographical features, familiar to Adam, the original author of this part of the narrative. They were all destroyed, and the topography and geography completely changed when the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. God put the man in the garden to take care of it. Man's given work to do from the beginning, although what that work was to be is difficult to conceive, as there would have been no weeds and other things to spoil the creation at this stage. The Septuagint calls the garden paradise. It would seem, though, that from the beginning, humans were not to be characterized by idleness, but by useful activity. Work would seem to be a necessary part of being a human. Someone put it, Adam lived to work, but we work to live. There's a lot of truth in that statement. He was allowed to eat of any tree freely except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The only thing that the man could not do was to eat from this tree. That was God's one law at this stage. The penalty for eating of this tree was death. You shall merit death, or literally, Hebrew says, dying, you shall die, which is an interesting way of putting it. Henry Moore says, the primary warning is undoubtedly that of spiritual death, or separation from God. But this also entails physical death, since God is the source of physical life as well as spiritual life. The moment Adam disobeyed God, the principle of decay and death would begin to operate in his body. And finally, this would overcome the built-in metabolic processes, and he would go back to dust from which his body was formed. Even though he continued functioning biologically for over 900 years, he died both spiritually and in principle physically, the very day he rejected and disobeyed the word of God. And I think from that explanation, perhaps the Hebrew, dying, he will die, makes some sense, because he began that process of physical death as well as separation from God, spiritual death. God made man a creature of choice from the beginning. He had a choice here. He had a choice to eat from the forbidden fruit and disobey, or abstain from it and be obedient. God placed this tree there in the garden, told him not to eat it. Notice he did not force him not to eat it. He didn't put a fence around it so he couldn't eat it. He gave him a choice. And I would suggest that this also shows how much God cares for people. Choice is a sign of love. And I believe this was out of love. Love to be love must be freely given. God could have created us to love him no matter what, and therefore always be obedient. But he loves us, and God is love, and love seeks to be reciprocated. So he made us creatures of choice to freely return his love. We also find the first general covenant between God and man, for I see part of this in Genesis chapter 1. Humans were to populate the earth, chapter 1, verse 28. They were to subdue the earth, same verse. They were to exercise dominion over the animal creation, same verse. They were to care for the Garden of Eden and enjoy its fruit, chapter 1, verse 29, chapter 2, verse 15. But they were also to refrain from eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, under the penalty of death. This covenant was terminated in chapter 3 by Adam and Eve eating of this forbidden fruit, which resulted in their spiritual and physical death, at least the death beginning, and created the necessity for a new covenant. The remaining part of chapter 2 talks about the creation of a helper for the man. God did not want Adam to be alone, so he looked for a helper for him. Some translations have a helper fit for him. That phrase helper fit literally means a helper corresponding to him. Notice, of all that is said about creation, there's only one thing that was not good, and that was for man to be alone. So animals were brought to Adam. He gave them names. Its text says that God formed. Probably would be better God had formed, as McCord in his translation has, since the animals had already been created. The alternate view is that that certain particular examples of animals already created were formed and brought to the man. The Hebrew constructions allows this as being had formed as a legitimate translation, though. Henry Morris suggested that God did not bring every animal that had been created, but only those which would have been the best candidates to be with man. Birds and various animals would have been brought, but not fish, not creeping things, maybe not some of the wild animals. But we have no idea how many of the kinds that God had created that appeared before Adam. Some have suggested that it would take Adam too long to name all the various kinds of animals. But think about that. If he could name 10 per minute, in 5 hours, around 3,000 different kinds could have been named, which is more than adequate time to do this. Whatever name he chose was what it was given, which tells us that Adam had good intelligence and could quickly decide the best name for each kind. Notice also that man had the ability to communicate through speech from the time he was created. I believe these were brought to him so that he could see that none of these would make suitable companions. He would have seen that he was different, that he was unique, and that he alone had no mate. Now, God did not need that information. He already knew that an animal was not the helper that man needed. But Adam needed to realize that although animals can be good to have around, they are not to be man's companion to share his life with. No helper was found for him. Peter Williams put it this way: man could name the animals, but the animals could not name him. There's a communication problem, is there not? Although, here Morris says, in all the animal kingdom there could not be found a helper like him. He alone of all creatures was really alone, and that was not good. Before God could declare his creation finished and very good, this all-important deficiency must be eliminated. God would provide such a helper and companion for Adam, one like him, and yet different, perfectly complementing him and completing God's work. You know, we often say that dog is a man's best friend. But, that's not God's view. A man's best friend is to be his wife. A woman's best friend is to be her husband. God then made a helper for man. This term, suitable helper, or whatever the equivalent is that your translation has, literally means one worthy to stand by his side, or one like him who stands before him. I can't help but think that would have been Adam's reaction when he first saw Eve. Wow! He'd seen the animals, nothing suitable there, and then he sees the woman. She was to be a central part of him. She was not inferior to him, nor was he superior to her. She has the same right to enjoy life as man does, and she is an equal heir with him, of the grace of life. Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, "Likewise, husbands, live understandingly with your wives, as with those who are more delicate. Bestow honor of them as being fellow heirs of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered." And a man needs to treat his wife as he does himself, as he would his own body. Paul wrote this in Ephesians 5, and we're familiar with it. "Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the called out people. He gave himself for them, that he might set them apart. With the word, he cleansed them by the washing of the water. He presented the called out people to himself in splendor, having no spot or flaw or any such thing. They are unblemished and set apart. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh. He nourishes and cares for it, even as Christ loves the called out people. We are members of his body. Therefore, a man will leave his father and mother and become one with his wife. The two will be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I'm speaking about Christ and the called out people. Moreover, let each one love his wife as he loves himself. Let the wife see that she respects her husband." God deliberately created man in two distinct acts. First the male, then the female out of the male. But both make up man. They're both called Adam in Genesis 5:2. Why did God make humans in two phases? Here's some thoughts from Jim McGuigan's book, Genesis and Us. He says, man was a plural unity. They complete each other. This stresses the fact that man was made for fellowship, for life within relationships. Man is social, wasn't created to be alone. This reflects the loving fellowship within the Godhead. Man is in God's image, and God is a community being made up of three persons, if you will. This reflects the relationship of God's people to Jesus. That's what we just read about, Ephesians chapter 5. I always thought that was interesting, that this is not really talking about husband and wife. It's talking about Christ and his people. But husband and wife is used to illustrate that. Adam was put to sleep to bring forth Eve. Jesus, if you think about it, was put to sleep. He died so that the bride then could make her appearance. Of course, he came back to life before she made her appearance as well. Jim McGuigan writes, if God's loving intention is for us to enjoy life together, what will Satan's aim be? If love, as in God, results in life together, what will sin produce but division? So God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep. He took one of his ribs and made a woman. Man and woman were made of identical substances. And by the way, we have here the first surgery, don't we? And we have God's last act of creation. As is often mentioned in weddings, woman was made from man's side, under his arm and close to his heart. That, by the way, is a statement originally made by Matthew Henry. The significance in this is that man and woman were originally one. Each needs the other to be complete. And that sure isn't a popular view today in our politically correct society. Note that although woman's body came from man's, man did not give her a soul and spirit. Those are God-given. I read this in a book a few years ago. The creation of woman was something special, above even the creation of man. While man was made from the dust of the ground and was dust refined, woman was made from man and was dust doubly refined. I like that. Notice that a woman's creation was different than both man's and the animals. She was made specially by God, which reinforces her importance and further describes her relationship to man. Man was made from the earth. woman was made from man. The word, by the way, for made in verse 22 in Hebrew is the word bana, B-A-N-A-H, which means to build. The woman was built from the man's substance. Have you ever thought about this? Why did God use a rib? Well, he had plenty of them, there's no doubt about that. But it's interesting. When a rib is removed for some reason during surgery, if the sheath around the rib is not removed, the rib will grow back. Perhaps that's why a rib was used. This sheath is called the periosteum, and the literal word meaning of that word is around the bone. It's a membrane that covers every bone. The periosteum contains cells that can manufacture new bone. Particularly in young people, rib periosteum has a remarkable ability to regenerate bone, perhaps more so than any other bone. I found that information from an article that Carl Wieland wrote and published in Creation magazine. God then presented the woman to the man. So I guess you could say we have the first wedding. Adam names this being woman. Now, in the Hebrew, works out interestingly. The Hebrew word for man is ish, and the Hebrew word for woman is ishisha, if I can say that. Literally, female man. Notice that woman is to be a man's suitable helper, not his servant. God from creation explained the purpose of marriage as to become one flesh. Friendship shows that we are a social being, but marriage at its best tells it better than friendship. Being husband and wife is the closest human relationship possible that we can experience. Men and women are not independent of each other. After marriage, it can no longer be my, but must become our. They are equal spiritual heirs of heaven. Notice that the original intent of marriage, a man was to leave his parents and be joined to his wife. They are then one flesh, one man, one woman for life. In a literal way, the first man and woman were one flesh because she was made from man, and we recreate that when we marry. The King James Version says that they're to cleave. English Standard has they're to hold fast. But the idea is they're to stick to each other. And as Elvis Hufford once put it, that indicates a sticking stronger than super glue. I like that. Before marriage, the most important relationship is with your parents, your father and mother. But after marriage, the most important relationship is to be with your spouse. Independent households with shared responsibility, mutual sexual privilege are God's will for marriage. And we see from this that God's intention for man is to marry, and that his social, physical, and emotional needs would be met by his wife. Now, that does not mean that marriage was commanded. Some live without marriage to better serve God's kingdom. Some never find a mate. Jesus talked about this. But a productive life can be enjoyed without marriage. But the biblical norm is one man and one woman for life. These needs, the social, the physical, and the emotional, the sexual would be included in that, in the idea of one flesh, are to be met through your wife and the wife through the husband, which is quite different to what we see in our society today. Paul said that celibacy, which is the only biblical option to marriage, is good if you can control yourself, but it was better to marry than to burn. In societies where celibacy is required, sexual perversion is prevalent. And we're seeing that over and over again in investigations into the Roman Catholic Church, are we not? Celibacy does not mark super spiritual growth. We all have desires which have been placed in us by God. And God has also given us the way to have these needs and desires met. When a man and woman marry, they become a dual creation because they become one flesh. joined to and belonging to each other. Edwin Jones writes, in creating man as male and female and to come together as one flesh, God said something about the mystery of his own triune nature. To tamper with the roles of men and women or to distort the nature of marriage is to make a fundamental attack on God himself. Verse 18 emphasizes three words which form a triangle of understanding for a proper view of marriage. At the top of the triangle is the word good. It's good for men and women to have a proper relationship in marriage with a member of the opposite sex. That's the way God made us. The word good, though, in Hebrew is more than the absence of bad. It speaks of the full, well-rounded enjoyment of God's blessings. Marriage is not just fundamental for a stable society. It's good for men and women. At the base of the triangle is this word helper. Our mate is to be one who helps us. This would eliminate selfishness and envy in marriage because these can't exist when true help is being offered. Although mentioned in the context of the woman, Ephesians 5 would give strong implications that the man is to act in a similar way towards his wife. And then the support from the triangle would be the word suitable, or the word fit. The Hebrew word, as mentioned earlier, means corresponding to. Delitzsch, quoted by Ed Jones, says this means a helping being in which, as soon as he sees it, he may recognize himself. That's good. While men and women are different, they share in the fact that both were created in God's image. Men and women are made to be at their best together. At this point, Adam and Eve are naked. They're without shame. They don't know anything different, as they are innocent of sin. This could be indicating that this is the one relationship, husband and wife, where we would not feel ashamed over anything. That is right. They are not yet at this point even aware of evil, and do not know that their bodies can be used for wrong. Ed Jones says, prior to sin, Adam and Eve could stand naked before God and not be ashamed. Sin brings fear and embarrassment. It cheapens and distorts those things that have a sense of nobility and decency. When decent and noble things remain pure and untarnished, mankind is greatly enriched. Sin has robbed man of an innocence whose value far exceeded the knowledge gained by eating the forbidden fruit. In principle, we now observe this sad loss as we see children losing their innocence as they become affected by the sinful influences around them. Sin is a terrible thing. Sin has distorted virtually everything in life, and maybe especially how we view sex. From being something beautiful and fulfilling as God intended, to becoming something shameful to some, an obsession to others, and a huge problem in our society today. Some have suggested that sexual relations were not practiced in the Garden of Eden, but came later, and are somehow associated with sin. But that's easily disproved by looking at verse 24. They were one flesh. Some other interesting points from this section. The woman took man's name, Ishasha, or however you pronounce it. It's also notable that God did not make another man for Adam. See, homosexuality is a perversion of God's plan. Man and man or woman and woman are not compatible in the way man and woman are. Not physically, and definitely not emotionally. God's plan does not, by the way, include divorce. It'd be a bit hard for Adam and Eve to even contemplate such a course of action. The first family was created as every family should be. In Matthew 19, when Jesus was discussing divorce, he said that divorce wasn't from the beginning. And then he basically restored marriage to its original state by quoting from Genesis chapter 2. He says that in the beginning, marriage was pure. It then became corrupted with polygamy and divorce. It results in quarreling and jealousy. But Jesus then restored it back to its original pure form. That's a diagram, by the way, I got from Everett Hufford Sr. when I took a course in Genesis under him. But you know what's significant? The ethnologists and anthropologists study past cultures. They discover that monogamous permanent marriage has always been the ideal and preferred form of family life everywhere. This could hardly be the product of evolution, as this is not what we see in other primates and mammals. There are a few exceptions, but it's very, very rare. We can see principles for marriage in what happened in chapter 2. We see the unity of man and woman as expressed in one flesh. We see the indissolubleness of the marriage bond, except for, as we find later, the extreme grounds of fornication. God intended marriage to be a lifelong relationship. We see that monogamy was God's original intention. We see the social equality of men and women. We see the submissiveness of the wife to the husband, as is also seen in our willingness to be submissive to Jesus. You know, it's interesting that there in Ephesians 5, God chose marriage to illustrate our relationship to Jesus. Perhaps if we contemplated that more, we'd understand marriage more. Peter Williams wrote, "Our failure today to accept the Bible's teaching on the sanctity of marriage and the headship or leadership of the man in God's scheme of things has brought with it disastrous consequences for society. From the Christian perspective, the failure to accept fully the doctrine of the headship of the man has also had its effect upon marriage and the family. In this regard, men have been influenced by today's unisex philosophy rather than by the clear teaching of the Word of God." You know, men and women may have differing roles, but that has nothing to do with superiority or inferiority. God made us different. Richardson, which is quoted by Edwin Jones, said, "False and sentimental notions of the equality of the sexes do not exalt but dishonor womanhood, which has its own distinctive excellence, an excellence that is different from man's." So we consider Genesis chapter 2, look back on it. There's some lessons that we've looked at there, especially concerning marriage, some lessons that are useful for us. Next lesson will be on Genesis chapter 3, and we'll continue looking at Adam and Eve, and we're going to be looking at the first sin. We hope this lesson was useful, at least maybe get us to think, and we hope you can join us for our next one.